Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for another edition of D&I One-on-One. Although today we're doing things a little differently. Normally I have a guest with me, and that will start next week. Today we're taking a little different approach. And so today our learning objectives are to do a quick review of D&I and really look at the connection between diversity and culture. And that's not going to be a direct connection, but really all these things together. And then we're going to look at a few elements or topics that I'm hoping to cover over the course of the next year. Now, I just need to fix something on my end. Bear with me. I thought I had one of these settings straight. Chris, I did see a question that came in while you were talking. Hopefully you saw it about the link to the download not working. So just want to make sure everybody has access to that. So again, I'm Jana Etienne. I host this series. This is the third year of the series. I'm excited to be back. And today we're going to look forward at what's going to come up in the course of this year. So we're going to start, I've divided this really into two sections. The first is the overview where we'll look at strategy, we'll look at some of those elements, we'll look at some of the implications and the importance of that strategy. I even have a numbers example to show you because accountants like numbers. Where do I want to start then? It's really just the overarching foundation. For organizations interested in starting or moving forward their D&I efforts, there's some basic areas that serve as the foundation. So first, it's guiding principles. So these are the core values that are supporting that work. Next is the approach, and that's really your perspectives around the work. Why are you doing the work? And there are a lot of areas. I'll show you those in a moment. I put in here terminology, and that's important because there has to be some fluency as it relates to the work, because when you're doing the work, you got to talk about it. So what are the terms? And then lastly, the framework. And so this is the methodology. How do you do strategy stuff? So that's the question. And how any organization does strategy, any strategy, that's how you do all strategy. So let's take them one by one. So the first one is what are the guiding principles? And I love this book. I highly recommend it. Simon Sinek has a lot of different books. But what I like about this book is that it frames everything in the context of our underlying why. Why is purpose? Why is our motivation? Why is our compass? It's the direction we head off in. It doesn't tell us how, but so long as we know where we're going, we can map a path to get there. So the quote here says, for those who have an open mind for new ideas, who seek to create long-lasting success and believe that your success requires the aid of others, I offer you a challenge. Start with why. And so that's why I love this quote, because the concept underlies what your organization is doing. So what do I mean by that? Now, I call this It Takes a Village, and that's because everybody has a role to play. Diversity and inclusion isn't a single person activity. You can't relegate it to one part of the organization. So what are the different layers then? Well, at the very top layer, there's the organization. And so the organization is really about what do we need to create a strategy? What are we trying to achieve? What is our goal? And we want to be explicit about it. So there isn't any confusion. This can't be a check the box activity. We don't want this to be a standalone thing. So we do stuff here, we run the business, and then over here we do D&I. It doesn't quite work that way. And it can't get relegated to HR because it's just a people thing. So the next one is that leadership level. So if the organization has an idea of what the why is, we are doing this because this is how it relates to our key business objectives. This is what we're trying to achieve in the business. This is how D&I supports that. The changes that we might need in the hows and the ways that we do things, systems, policies, process, to achieve that goal. Now, as a leader, why does this matter to each of us? Now, the important thing here is leadership takes on many forms, and there are different levels of leadership. I'm talking about all these levels of leadership. How does this translate to how I lead my team, how I lead the organization, this department at every level? I don't know the quote exactly, I don't remember it, but and I was just talking, somebody said it so nicely yesterday, that people don't leave organizations, they leave people. This is why managers are so important. As long as leaders are very clear on their why, it will start to show up in their behaviors. And then the last level is the individual level. This is you and me. This is why this work matters to us. It's understanding how um, these interactions that we have day to day influence the connection we have in the workforce. And we know as humans, we're pack animals. And so how we relate to each other forms how I feel about working here. And this is really important, especially for the younger generation. Younger millennials, I heard the term for Gen Z, Zoomers. I struggle with that one because if anybody has a dog and the dog does the zoomies, that's how I'm connecting it. But all right, enough of that. Next. All right, so we understand what our why is. This gives us now an opportunity to reframe diversity. It's a commitment, and there's action behind that commitment. It's embedded in our organizational strategy. We understand how D&I and what we need to do about D&I will move us to achieve our goals and objectives. And that we identify diversity and inclusion not as a separate thing, but in every aspect of the way we be, the way we do in an organization. It's environmental social governance that is another level of D&I, but overarching the goal. All right, so I will be monitoring the Q&A. I want you to know it's on the bottom half of my screen and it's really small. I might need to put my glasses on, but please use your question Q&A feature to pass along thoughts, responses, and then questions as we go. All right, Chris, it is time for our first polling question.
Poll question 1 is active, folks. Has your organization connected DEI to its key business objectives? Make your choices now. This poll is active for 60 seconds.
And while that poll is open, I know I have about 30 seconds, a question came in. We have a diverse organization. How do we make sure that the staff know this was intentional and not just an accident? Brian, thank you for that question. And the answer is because you say so. If you talk about something, then I'm aware that you are aware. Too often we assume. And so if the diversity we see is an intentional effort, we want to express that, not just the commitment, but the evidence. So see the responses come in here.
This is a very sharp group. Try and answer quickly, folks. We'll close down poll 1 in 3, 2, and 1. Closing poll 1. I will share results really quickly here. It's kind of split, but the majority at 37% rather are saying yes, followed by 17% in progress, 24% not sure, and 22% saying no. So back to you.
Right. My CPA self is stressed to do this math. Little less than half are in the not sure and the no. The better news here is that 22% said no. So everyone else is in some level of that. I'm really encouraged to hear that. All right, so moving forward, I talked about that overall objective. Now let's talk about approach. So I use something in my work. Wow, I discovered this probably back in 2015. It's an amazing resource. It's open to all. You don't have to be a diversity consultant or specialist to use this. And it's called the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmarks, more commonly referred to as the GDEIB. It's a globally developed benchmarking tool that organizations can use to develop strategy. It has standards and best practice in there, definitions, and benchmarks. And by using the benchmarks, it can help identify goals, objectives, and measures for progress. Now, as part of the GDEIB, they offer these 5 approaches to D&I. And the approach that your organization has, if it hasn't been explored, if your organization is already launching a D&I strategy or in the midst of implementing a D&I strategy, I certainly encourage organizations to come back here and think, what is our approach? What is the perspective we're taking? And that's because it's almost like um, a filter. And I don't know why it just popped into my head. Sunglasses come in different shades and tones. And whatever pair of sunglasses you put on, it influences the way you see things. You're seeing the same things, but the filter is slightly different. Well, that's what I mean here by approach. It really provides that filter. So the 5 approaches are competence, and competence is really that fluency that I'll talk to here in a moment. It's ensuring that the organization across the board is competent around the principles, the concepts, and the purpose behind diversity and inclusion work. Compliance, that's are we complying with all the rules, the regulations, all the codes, what have you. I live in the state of Maryland, and recently, this is the first year that there's something called the diversity addendum. I actually was looking at it earlier and I tossed it. I'm not, because I'm paperless, and I'm not sure what it's called, but essentially what it's requiring businesses that have, I believe, $5 million of revenue or more or less to report the diversity in their leadership ranks. And then the measures that they're implementing in terms of a D&I strategy. They're like 12 items and you have to check off more than 4 or 5. Like one of them is, does your organization have a stated commitment to D&I? This is required by the state along with their annual report. So that's an example of compliance with rules and regulations. And we're starting to see more of requirements like this. Definitely something to be mindful of in the local jurisdictions where you do business, the state rules, as well as possible government contracts that you might be either pursuing or have in place. So that compliance piece might definitely be one of the overlap areas in terms of approaches. The next one is honoring dignity. And that's really looking at the value and interconnectivity of us as humans and how do we respect and honor that. Developing the organization is around performance. It's strengthening our ability to perform, which means better profitability generally. And then social justice. And social justice, it's important, but I like to put it separate from the other areas of diversity and inclusion. It's integrated, but unfortunately, some people see that as political, and it's not necessarily political, also, although some of that is involved. But it's really around equity, locally and across the globe, and how your organization participates in that. Now, the next one is terminology. And terminology comes down to how do we talk about this stuff? And it starts with the basics. So on the surface, look, these are the words: diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. In terms of the words themselves, we kind of know the definition, but the context of the language does matter. And when it comes to diversity and inclusion, which is the same thing that was in that question that was asked earlier, we want to be explicit, but we also want to make sure we're not making assumptions about what the terms mean. And one of my, I don't want to say pet peeves, because actually that's probably the wrong way to frame it. One of my goals in this work is to really enforce that we need to decouple these terms, because diversity and inclusion has become a word and they're distinctly different concepts. Now, I have a question here from Bill. How do you objectively measure diversity and inclusion? Well, that comes down to things like what are the demographics in your organization? What are the demographics of your client base or the community where you work or the places where you recruit? And that's just diversity. Then you get to equity. That's really about assessing your policies. Inclusion, that's evaluating and collecting feedback from your employees on to see what they feel about inclusion being what are the efforts of the organization, and belonging being what does it feel like to work here. And in fact, let's walk through those definitions, because for each of these, there's a different way to measure them. And some of them, unfortunately, Bill, are not objective. Belonging will always be subjective. So let's look at these. We're not going to dig deeply into them and talk more about why they're complicated, the nuances of them, how do we evaluate and so forth. But I want to start with the basics, which is the first one, diversity. I actually had a conversation yesterday. Somebody asked me, what does diversity mean? And in short, difference. I want you to think of it as demographics. But I also want to recognize that diversity is way more complex. And you can spend time just here doing some training and doing and building awareness. Now, this is a graphic I put together. There are a lot of them that you can find. If you just Google diversity iceberg, you'll find so many versions of it. But the way I've designed mine, you have a traditional iceberg. The top half of an iceberg, it's what we can see. We don't have to do anything. It's there. We see it. What's below the water line, though, is the majority of the iceberg. I think it's like 6/7 of an iceberg is below the water. You can't see it. But in fact, if you're sitting on the water and you look down, you can see a little bit under the water, but you can't see all the way to the bottom. So what I've done here, and you'll notice there's gradients of how dark the descriptions are, because the deeper we go below that water line of visibility, the more invisible some of these invisible elements are. And in order to really understand this level of diversity and these different dimensions of diversity, one, it requires awareness. What does this mean? And then two, how do we know these things? Because some things we'll know and other things we won't. But just becoming aware that these differences exist helps us all be thoughtful in the workplace. So diversity, just talking about these differences and identifying them. And there's a lot of data out there that talks about how just having diverse workforce is a boost to profitability. There are a lot of statistics, but here are 4 simple reasons why. So when you have a diverse workforce, it attracts more diversity. And more candidates today say, I am interested in a company if the company is more diverse and expresses and demonstrates that commitment. So I'm not even going to pursue a job, or I might not accept an offer if I don't think the company is diverse. And that isn't because I'm a minority. I might be a white cisgender man and still have that perspective. But it's increasingly important to the minorities in seeking jobs. The next one is innovation. The reality that we know is when you listen to different viewpoints and you have an opportunity to explore and exchange ideas, it usually fosters a more rich brainstorming and collaborative conversation, resulting in higher levels of creativity, resulting in more innovation, ultimately leading to boosts in profits. Customer satisfaction, and that's because we mirror the customers we serve, the community we work in, and so we can better align our services and our messaging for those clients, potentially attract new clients as a diverse workforce serving a diverse customer or client base. And so that also gets to number 4. And so there's a lot of data behind that. There are entire sessions I've done around this. But this is an important concept to understand. Now this next one, get your fingers ready. Drop your answer here into the Q&A. I'd love to see the responses. This is a visual of a track, starting line for a track meet. And if you're going to run the 800 meter, which side of this would you want to be on, the regular starting line, or would you like to be in the staggered start line? Which of these two feels more fair? And the reason I'm asking it that way is the word fairness is often confused with equity and equality. So the reason that what I mean by that is equitable means we are adjusting, providing differentiated resources, etc., versus equal, everybody's getting the same thing. Somebody said lane 1 in the staggered start. And what's interesting about that is the beauty of the staggered start is whether I'm starting in lane 1 or lane 2, I'm still running 800 meters or the 400 meter. Maybe the 400 meters is a better example. And so it doesn't matter the lane if there's a staggered start. If there isn't a staggered start, I tell you, I want to be in lane 1 in the regular track, because lane 1 in a regular track all the way around is the shortest distance. So then what's the definition of equity? Equity is defined as working toward fair outcomes for people or groups by treating them in ways that address their unique advantages and barriers. So if somebody has an advantage, we don't want that advantage to play out against the rest of the workforce. So what do we need to do to ensure a level playing field? So both of those starting lines are fair, depending on the race we're running. And that's the point I want to make, that fairness can show up in the form of equality, and fairness can show up in the form of equity. All right, the next one is inclusion. Here's a definition of inclusion that I like. Environment that values, appreciates, and welcomes employees of all backgrounds and diverse characteristics, doesn't strive to ignore differences or adopt a colorblind mindset, but everyone feels supported. Policy systems and practices ensure everyone has equal opportunities. Now, the word equal shows up here again in terms of fairness. The reason I like this and the things I want to point out are three. Number one, doesn't strive to ignore differences. I don't want you to pretend like I'm not a person of color. I don't want you to pretend that I'm not a woman. I want you to see that. I also want it to not matter. And I want you to appreciate the different perspectives I may bring. Maybe it's because I am a woman of color, maybe not. But the color, the gender, disability, background, maybe I was a veteran, this is my first job, civilian job, whatever the case may be, shouldn't matter. And I should feel supported. And it's also ensuring that those policies and practices are in fact equitable. There's a quick slide here. You have the handout. This is a really great graphic put together by Deloitte that just shows that organizations that are more inclusive as a culture, the benefits are there. And then the last one is belonging. And belonging is a really important sense. As humans, we're pack animals. We have a need that's hardwired in our DNA to connect. Unfortunately, 40% of employees feel isolated at work. If we can foster that sense of belonging, which is it's experiential, it's how I feel here, different than inclusion, which is the space I want to foster as a company. I want to foster an inclusive environment. That means I'll feel like I belong here. Two sides, same coin. How do you measure those? To the question earlier, those are going to be subjective, but you want to ask those questions and get that sense so that you know where you need to work, what you need to work on in your organization. Now, how does this work down, come into numbers? Well, there's some data. This one is a survey that was done by BetterUp back in 2021. I hear it cited a lot. And what they found was people who felt a sense of belonging at work, there were boosts everywhere. Higher job performance, 56%. Less turnover risk, 50%. 75% fewer sick days. Here's some other statistics. They're 3 times more likely to look forward to coming to work. 9 times more likely to feel like people are being treated fairly regardless of race. So that sense of belonging is important. And I wanted to use that 75% fewer sick days. This is where I'm going to do a little math. I actually went out and I looked at the Accounting Today Top 100, and then I looked 2 or 3 firms and sort of averaged them together. Real numbers then is what influenced this. We're going to use absenteeism as a measure of disengagement. So first we have to calculate revenue per employee, and we have to figure out what the cost is of salary when somebody takes a sick day or a day of leave. So 2.7 sick days is an average, works out to 21.6 hours a year or 1%. And so from there, we can calculate the cost to the company when somebody is absent for 1 day. And that's $3,806 in my example. We pay out $780 in salary, and we lose the opportunity to earn $3,000 in revenue. So let's translate that over the course of a year for the number of employees we have, and it adds up to $1.4 million in the cost of absenteeism. Now, if we can reduce that to 5.4 hours a year, then we are down to 0.3%. So what does that mean? Our absenteeism drops from 1.4 million to $360,000. That's a savings of $1 million. Now, this is an oversimplified example. It gets a little bit more complex. No, there's a polling question coming up here in a minute. Sorry. I do have 4 polling questions. They're just not distributed evenly based on time. What's important to know here is that when you have employees who do not feel a sense of belonging, they are disengaged. And as a result of being disengaged, they take more days, they take more sick days, they use more of their personal leave. And that costs the organization money and salary without a benefit in return, revenue. Hard dollars, we can do this analysis for a company. It's not as simple as this. That's important to understand. So really just the last 2 points here, then all of this comes together in the term of culture. When people feel that sense of collection, that collective sense of connection, it powers performance, not just individually and not just in teams, but organizationally. And leaders are an important part of that. Go all the way back to the beginning of organizational why, and we look at the overarching guiding principles. That's why all of these elements together lay a foundation for the details. And the details are here. These are the things that we need to think about. How are we actually going to structure this project operationally? What is our oversight process? How do we as an organization build strategic plans? Because how we do one thing is how we do everything. What's our day-to-day management? What's our reporting process? How often, to whom, how transparent, internal, external? It could go on. Now somebody asked for a polling question. Here you go. Polling question number 2.
Poll 2 is active, folks. Where do you think your organization needs assistance with its DEI efforts? Make your choices now, folks. 60 seconds.
I'll go back to that track analogy, by the way. Everybody that responded said staggered start. A couple people did say lane 1. And I think I would like to have lane 1 just because I can see where everybody's ahead of me. I always wonder about those people who are running on a long race and they can't see somebody gaining on them in the background. And so they think they're running and then somebody overtakes them. And then, whew, I just can't imagine that feeling. I wouldn't want it myself. All right, so looking here, we're halfway through the poll. I have a couple slides in here. You'll see the pictures. There's a quote from Verna Myers, and she says, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. That's a very common quote, and it's a beautiful idea, and I think it really helps differentiate those 2 terms, diversity and inclusion. All right, we're at a minute here. What is the answer?
All right, folks, we'll close out poll 2 in 3, 2, and 1, closing out. And the attendees are coming in at 39% at the majority saying belonging, i.e. culture, employee engagement.
And it's interesting because these not equal, but they're distributed across the options, which means there's a lot of opportunity to work in this space. So diversity, being invited to the party, inclusion, being asked to dance. I like this one even better. And that is belonging is dancing like nobody is watching. So that's one of my favorite pictures. I mean, quotes, and I thought I like the picture. Somebody said the second polling question should have had an all of the above option. Thank you. Or check all that apply. I think I meant to set it up as an all that apply. So that is my setting it up incorrectly. But I do appreciate that all of the above is often what I see in working with clients, that there's a little bit of everything that we try to factor in. We don't want to lean into one thing and ignore the other. All right, so that's a lot of the foundation, a lot of the background. Remember, this is a bi-weekly series. We start next week, so these first 2 sessions are back to back. Going forward, you can see on the calendar every other week, registration hopefully will start to open up maybe a week or 3 in advance. What are we going to be talking about? Well, the first thing that I hope to see in the schedule, and these might not be individual sessions, but thematic over the course of the year, is this idea, the Great Reshuffle. And when I was preparing for this session, I started laughing. Well, I wasn't internally, I was laughing out loud, hoping nobody in my house thought I was going crazy. But the Great Resignation, quiet quitting, quiet hiring, there are so many terms that came out. And I don't know, I was thinking about quiet working. I mean, what is it going to be next time? And in my brain, maybe we're already quietly working because we dress for our video conferences from the waist up And then from the waist down, we're in our pajamas. I don't know, or sneaking into my office to get on a Zoom. I just started having these crazy ideas. But these terms, to some degree, I want you to dismiss them, set them aside, and then look at the deeper meaning behind them. Now, what this is really getting at are the same things that we've been talking about since the first 6 or 8 months in COVID and navigating COVID, and what we are starting to learn about that. And these issues and these challenges are persisting. And so that's why we want to be thinking about these, not in the terms of quiet quitting and great reshuffle, great resignation, the graying of America. There's so many of these things out there. What's behind that? Well, there are a couple of things that are behind that. There are changing perceptions about work. And so by that, our priorities, our identities, our worldview, the line we draw between health and family and work and purpose, how we use our time, these are changing, and they are different for different groups. They are different for different generations. Employees are starting to question, is it worth it working here? Is it worth it doing this? That is then influencing retention, recruitment, advancement. Hybrid. Oh, wow, this is a big thing. Do I have to be in the office? Can I be remote entirely? And the reason is, can I work for a company across the country? Or do I have to work in a location where if they call me into the office, I have an office to go into here without a 4-hour commute, for example? And so this is something to think about. A lot of companies are exploring hybrid models. One of the challenges here is they're not really clear policy-wise about when do you come in the office, and then what are the agreements that teams have to have? How do we define the norm of a hybrid office and a hybrid work model? And how do you balance that with flexible work? So some of these nuances, some of this is HR policy, some of this is communication and team management, leadership expectation. So that's why the great reshuffle, as I'm describing it here, are some topics I want to cover this year. I found an interesting statistic. Let me find it here. 43% of employees are somewhat or extremely likely to consider changing jobs in the coming year so that they can balance out the flexibility hybrid work thing, including moving to an area, looking at moving, which would require them to have a job that is entirely remote. Influences then companies I'm willing to work for and roles that I'm willing to take. And it's not just the rank and file. This was the interesting one. 47% of leaders are likely to consider applying for jobs that are not near their home next year. So, I mean, there's a lot here that I would like to explore. The next thing I want to explore this year is mental health and wellness. And this, we're hearing increasingly a lot more about it. I did a webinar recently on how to balance, mindfulness, intention, and self-awareness as it comes to balance and managing our energy. As we are, for those of you in public accounting, this is a stressful time of year. How do we manage that stress to stay intact psychologically, emotionally, physically? Some people get physically ill during tax seasons. How do we manage that? Well, what does this mean? How do we talk about it? How do we demonstrate it? How do we normalize this? How do we strip away stigma? There are a lot of employees, less than half of employees know if there are mental health services, an employee assistance program, and other resources available through their company. And most 4 out of 5 employees say that stress and workplace stress not only affects their relationships with their coworkers, that's the part we assume, but with their family and friends as well. This is a very real issue. And younger generations, defined as Millennial and Gen Z, find this increasingly important and a priority in terms of picking a job, picking a role, staying with an existing position. Next one I want to talk about, neurodiversity. I've had a lot of people ask about this, and we will definitely be talking about this again. I did one session on this, I think it was 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, but I think it's important to revisit this and revisit it because now that we're starting to appreciate those different dimensions of diversity, we're looking at more of those invisible dimensions. And neurodiversity really speaks to the way that our brains are wired differently. And it has a lot of influence in the way we lead, the way we manage, the way we set expectations, the way people work, the way we perceive other people's confidence and performance levels. There's a lot here. And so understanding neurodiversity is becoming, there's a lot more interest. I can't tell you how many webinars I've seen on this in the last month alone. So I definitely want to explore this a little bit more deeply because understanding these things can help us connect better with our colleagues and manage as lead in organizations. One simple example, introvert, extrovert. We function differently. We use our energy differently, different types of interactions. It costs some of us more energy than others. And there's a lot of pressure in the corporate workspace, particularly in white collar professions, to behave like an extrovert. And so understanding that is really important. Somebody said you have to establish boundaries for surviving tax season. Bravo. You know, boundaries help us with a lot of things. It's just in the workplace, we're not always confident that establishing that boundary won't cost us professionally. Intersectionality, this has come up a couple of times, and that is really around recognizing that we have multiple dimensions of diversity. You can't just serve one. Simple example. I am a minority. I am a woman. I have an invisible disability. Those three things alone mean, and I'm half, my mother's from the Philippines. So if you were going to have an employee resource group for women, people of color, the Pan-Asian community, and disabilities, there I am in all four. And any solution for one group doesn't necessarily serve my needs based on when you look at it from an intersectional perspective. It doesn't mean we need to try to address everything for everyone. It does mean we want to be aware of what this means because it influences how we do what we do, the types of solutions that we identify. Psychological safety. There's a lot more conversation about this, and so organizations are starting to dig into more what this means. Psychological safety is creating that space where people feel safe enough to share their ideas, to ask questions, to push back on the status quo, suggest new ideas. That brainstorming I was referencing in diverse groups before, that does require psychological safety. So you now have, I don't want to say it, but I'll say it anyway, an intersectionality of the different aspects of this work. We look at diversity and the benefits of diversity in terms of the boost of performance. But one of the things we don't always talk about is in order to enjoy those benefits of diversity, you have to have inclusion. Diversity without inclusion just means you have a bunch of different people working in the same space. You can put in a lot of effort to diversify the workforce, but if you spend all of your time trying to hire people in and never for one moment think about what it's going to feel like when they work there, you're going to have a retention problem and you will not enjoy those benefits of diversity. Psychological safety then, what does it mean? How do we express it and reinforce it? How do we build it? How do we show it as leaders? You know, leaders don't have to be perfect, but there's this pressure that feels like we do. Mindfulness. This is another area that we're starting to see more of in the workplace. The data tells us that mindfulness leads to better decision making. Mindfulness leads to more ethical decision making. Mindfulness helps drive self-awareness, which helps us to become more aware of the limits of what we know, which then helps in those brainstorming processes. Next topic I want to talk about is disability inclusion. Disability has a stigma. People who have a disability are perceived as less competent, are perceived as less capable. And that's why there's an intense pressure for people who have an invisible disability to hide it at all costs. And one of the challenges is this concept of accommodation. And there are laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's an example of D&I efforts that focus on compliance. Well, can we get beyond compliance? We need to understand accommodation. then we need to understand what that means in terms of practice and policy, and how stopping at the minimum level might not be serving our employees with disabilities and those without that do not have disabilities. So what does this mean? This is an important concept. Disability inclusion is the smallest part of a D&I effort, if it's even there at all. I personally want to see us work more on this in the corporate world and raise awareness. Another one is we're starting to see more targeted learning. So we've had these broad conversations, unconscious bias, uncomfortable conversations. I've been invited and had the opportunity to work with organizations and just understanding different identities, gender literacy, for example, feeling comfortable talking about gender expression. What is a pronoun? Why do they matter? What does LGBTQ stand for? Is the plus disrespectful, or does it honor members of this community? So we've spent some time, people are interested in that, but now we need to look in deeper. And I'm excited, on March 24th, coming up 2 or 3 sessions from now, we're going to be talking about indigenous communities, Native American. Is that even the right term? What does it mean? Do we understand what that looks like in the workforce? Military experience, I have somebody joining us in early April to talk about, transitioning from military service into civilian service, and what does that bring in terms of skill set? What are the challenges? What does the D&I effort look like within the military, and how does it reflect like what we're doing here in corporate America? And then what are some other groups what we're starting to see more work in? So caretakers, I've heard a lot of bigger companies starting employee resource groups for people who are caretakers, whether that means children, whether that means elder parents, whether that means supporting someone with a disability, recognizing the burden that brings to that person, and how that can create strain that then comes into the workplace, and how companies can support those people. And so starting to look beyond the traditional groups and think about other ways to support groups in the organization. And then 2 more slides, then we're getting to a polling question. Ethnicity, looking more at what is the difference between ethnicity and heritage, for example. Digging a little bit more into racial identity, because you're not just Black. There's a lot more to that identity. How do the demographic shifts that we're starting to see influence the way people see race, which in turn influences the way organizations should be approaching dialogue and understanding around race as a dimension of diversity? And what's the intersection between race and social justice, and how might that be influencing the dialogue? So there's a lot in every one of these slides, there's a lot to dig into. And then the last one is cultural awareness. And culture, it's about understanding how my culture, my background is influencing my body language, my mannerisms, facial expressions, the things that I say, like, wow, you're knocking that out of the park. Well, that makes sense in theory to every American, but that might not make sense to somebody from another culture who's thinking, what does that even mean? And these are little things. And these cultural differences influence the way we perceive performance, the types of connections that we build, whether or not any conversation might feel comfortable or uncomfortable. And it's a big driver of miscommunication in the workplace. All right, so polling question then. Chris?
I can handle that for you, absolutely. Poll question number 3, folks, is active on your screens right now. Which of these areas are most interested? Are you most interested in learning about? Make your choices now, folks. This poll is active for 60 seconds.
Now, I will say I wanted to make sure I got through this to leave plenty of time for Q&A. We actually have about 9 minutes left in the program after this poll, and I don't have any other things to present, although I could go back and talk about any of the topics. So please be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A, or I might have to make a couple up, which is fine. But I want to make sure I'm covering the things and hearing more about what you want to hear about. That helps me put together programs that are meaningful and that resonate. All right, a few more seconds here on the poll.
Indeed, folks, we'll close this poll down in 3, 2, and 1. And the showing
You
of
can leave
results
the results
there.
up a little bit longer, Chris, because I want to make a note of this if you don't mind.
Absolutely. The majority coming in at 50% are saying mental health and wellness at work. And the rest are camera split, as you can see them there.
I don't write fast enough.
That's okay. I'll read it out for you while you're writing that. At 14%, neurodiversity. 6% saying disability inclusion. 18% saying developing cultural fluency. And again, another 18% saying understanding different identities.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Now, the reason I think that that's so helpful, everyone, for answering that polling question, because it's an indication of where the interest is overall, and it actually supports what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing in terms of trending topics and areas of interest. Mental health and wellness has been something that has started to pop up more. The last part of the year, last year, I heard a lot more about it than I did at the beginning of last year. And then different identities, digging more into that. One of the reasons that exploring different identities is so helpful is it takes out the fear of talking to somebody who is different. And it creates some of that psychological safety, because as I understand different identities, I build that fluency and that comfort around them, because I now have a better sense of the things that I'm hearing people say, the behaviors that I might be noticing people. This is particularly true across cultures. All right, so somebody's asking, these are questions for you about the handouts, Chris. I can also tell everybody my contact information is at the end of this presentation. It's with every one of the slides. If for any reason you need, you're having trouble, just reach out to me. I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides.
Also, Jana, and to the audience, if you are having trouble accessing the handouts, they will indeed be all available in your accounts following the webinar.
Right, exactly. Thank you, Chris. So a question here, or maybe this is a comment, let me see. An interesting aspect is how other diversity teams affect mental health in the workplace for the employee. Other diversity items, maybe I should put on my glasses. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. None of these things can be taken in a vacuum. And when you focus on an aspect of diversity, that can trigger other concerns, reactions, experiences. And as a result of that, you might now have some other challenges. As we start to explore more, we learn more. And one of the things that we know is that when we start to understand some of those differences better, it actually starts to create stronger relationships, because now there's curiosity as well, where we're willing to invite somebody to coffee that we didn't necessarily know before. And now we're learning more about them, which is helping with that mental health piece, because I feel safer. I'm referring to these things in the same way because everything affects everything. That's what makes this work so exciting and also complicated and nuanced. In your diversity work in 2022, was there anything that was a surprise for you? Actually, I will say the one thing that I found most surprising was this hesitancy around pronouns and a lack of understanding about pronouns. Where I had someone reach out to me through LinkedIn privately to ask, okay, why does this matter? I had a client who was uncomfortable with using pronouns. I have had clients that kind of don't care, use them or don't use them, without really thinking about what that means. So I've had quite a bit of curiosity around pronouns, and so that one caught me by surprise. All right, I never enter my pronouns because I didn't feel it was necessary, but now I'm wondering if I should. Here's the thing. That this isn't a you should or you have to. This is more a question of respecting when someone else shares them. So for example, if I say my pronoun is them, they, then use them, they when referring to me. It's a matter of respect. Whether you share your pronouns with me or not, those who do, it tends to be meaningful to them. And then there's more conversation we can have around that. Oh, I just deleted one that wasn't the question. I'm sorry. I don't know which one I deleted. Is there a reason?
Here's another one that says here, can you recommend some reading materials or websites to further help with DEI?
Yes. I'm sorry. There's maybe what I should do is create a resources list. That's actually a good idea. Make a note. I think I might actually start putting some resources on my website. I am not trying to hype myself here at all, but there is an untold number of books and articles and organizations and programs that can help with this. So I'm going to take that as an action item on my part so that if I get asked again, I have something I can provide. Thank you for that. Somebody then asked, is there a resource for HR teams regarding neurodiversity and neurodiverse candidates? I'm not familiar with a specific one. So for believing that asking interview questions in advance is that a preferred method? That might be because of neurodiversity. That might be other elements of diversity that can be a benefit for, like race or disability. So there's a lot here. There's a comment to me. Thank you, Karen. I saw that comment. Please, you're welcome to do that. What is your response to an agency that has DEIA, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, is active, but the organization as a whole seems to keep missing the mark? I might want to reach out to the team leading D&I and explore and see if there's more I can learn. Is there a way I can volunteer? How can I support the effort? To be part of the conversation, then you can help to drive the conversation. The following topics be free. Yes, the webinars on the CPA Academy, this series of webinars are all free. And I'm looking at the time. You mentioned a book at the beginning. It was Start With Why by Simon Sinek. I should just pull all the books off of my bookshelf and talk about some other books that are available. That was the book that I learned. Another one actually that I like, and I'll actually grab it here, and it's because it's a very easy read. How to Say Anything to Anyone. So I'm going to hold it up here for a second. The reason I really like this book is because if we don't feel comfortable talking about diversity and inclusion, whether or not we understand the terminology, we're not going to make progress. I hope you join us for this series. This really means a lot to me, and for many people, D&I training isn't available in their organization, so pass the word to your colleagues and to your friends. This is open to everyone, not just accountants. Thank you for joining us today. It means so much to have you here.